In a small, warm village in Africa, there lived a kind and smart girl named Zainab. Zainab was very special because she had memorized the entire Quran. Every morning, as the golden sun rose over the horizon, she would sit quietly under the big mango tree near her home and recite the verses with a gentle, steady voice. Children from all around the village would gather to listen. They loved Zainab because she not only taught them the holy words, but also filled their hearts with hope and joy. Zainab's life was not always easy, though. At home, she had a very important job, taking care of her mother, Aisha. Aisha was old and often very sick, and she needed help with everything, from cooking meals to simply sitting with her all day. Even though Zainab was young, she took on these tasks with a sense of duty. But over time, the weight of responsibility began to press on her heart. While she loved her mother, she also dreamed of a life where she could freely learn and share the beauty of the Quran without worry. Every day, as she taught the children, Zainab's eyes would sometimes drift away, and her mind would wander to the many hours spent taking care of her ailing mother. Deep inside, a mysterious feeling of sadness and frustration started to grow. It was as if a heavy cloud was settling over her heart, a cloud that she could not shake off no matter how hard she tried. She would whisper quiet prayers, asking Allah for relief, but the feeling only grew stronger with time. Her closest friend, Halima, noticed the change. Halima was a bright and caring girl who always had a smile on her face. She would sit next to Zainab during the lessons and listen closely when Zainab recited the verses. One afternoon, after a long day of teaching, Halima took Zainab's hand and asked softly, "Why do your eyes look so sad today, Zainab? I know you always smile when you recite." Zainab hesitated. She loved sharing her thoughts with Halima, but was afraid that the truth might be too heavy for her friend. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "I feel like I am trapped between my duty to my mother and my dreams of learning more about the Quran. It feels like there is a weight on my heart, and I cannot move freely." Halima listened carefully and squeezed her hand, promising that she would always be there for her. That night, as the village lay in a peaceful silence under a sky full of twinkling stars, Zainab sat alone in her small room. The air was still, but her thoughts were loud and full of worry. She wondered why Allah had given her both a great gift and such a heavy burden. Her recitations that day had felt different, as if the words echoed back with sadness. The same verses that once brought her comfort now reminded her of the endless responsibilities that she carried. Outside, in the darkness, there was an almost magical feeling in the air. A soft, mysterious breeze rustled through the trees, and shadows danced on the walls of her humble home. It was as if the night itself knew the secret pain that Zainab was hiding. In those moments, her heart began to feel a strange heaviness, a feeling that would later bring even more surprises and conflicts to her life. As the days passed, this heaviness grew stronger, and Zainab found it more difficult to smile when she taught the children. Their little faces, so full of trust and hope, made her feel both happy and terribly sad. In her heart, she feared that one day, this weight would become too much for her to bear, and she might lose her way. But for now, she held on, hoping that her prayers would bring a change. Little did Zainab know, the mysterious feeling in her heart was only the beginning of a story that would soon shake the whole village. A story full of suspense and secrets, where every whispered prayer and every silent tear would lead to unexpected events, and where the line between right and wrong would blur in the most heartbreaking way. The sun had barely risen when the village was awakened by the sound of sorrowful cries. Women wailed, men murmured prayers, and children stood frozen in disbelief. Zainab, the girl who had memorized the Quran, had passed away in the early hours of the morning. The news spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the village. People spoke in hushed tones, some shaking their heads in sadness. She was so young, they whispered, so blessed. How could this happen? The villagers quickly gathered to prepare for the burial. According to tradition, she had to be buried before sunset. Baba Suleiman, the old gravedigger, was given the task of digging her grave. He had dug many graves before, and though his bones were weak, his hands were still strong. With his worn-out shovel, he made his way to the burial ground, followed by the villagers carrying Zainab's body wrapped in a white cloth. But something strange happened. As soon as Baba Suleiman pressed his shovel into the dry earth, his arms felt unusually heavy. It was as if an invisible force was pushing back against him. He ignored the strange feeling and kept digging. But with every strike of his shovel, the earth became harder, refusing to break apart. Sweat dripped down his forehead, and his hands trembled. "This is strange," he muttered under his breath. The villagers watched in confusion. Why was this grave so difficult to dig? Baba Suleiman had dug graves many times before, yet today, something felt different. After hours of struggling, he finally managed to create a deep enough hole. But just as he stepped back to wipe his brow, a strange sound came from the ground. Hiss! A cold, bone-chilling hiss echoed from the grave. Baba Suleiman's heart jumped. He peered inside, and what he saw made his skin crawl. A large, black snake slithered out from the bottom of the grave. It was unlike any snake he had ever seen, thick, with piercing red eyes that glowed like burning coal. The villagers gasped, stepping away in fear. "Allah have mercy!" someone shouted. But that was not all. One by one, scorpions started crawling out of the grave, their sharp stingers raised as if ready to attack. More snakes followed, twisting and writhing in the pit where Zainab was supposed to be buried. The villagers panicked. "This is a bad sign," an old woman cried, covering her mouth. "Why are these creatures appearing in her grave?" Someone rushed to fetch Maulam Musa, the respected scholar of the village. He arrived swiftly, his white robe flowing behind him. The villagers made way for him as he stepped forward. His eyes darkened as he saw the terrifying sight before him. "This is not normal," he said firmly. "Something is wrong." The people murmured in agreement. How could a girl who spent her life memorizing the Quran have such a grave? Why would the earth refuse her? "We will dig another grave," Maulam Musa finally declared. "Perhaps the land here is cursed." Baba Suleiman, though shaken, moved to another part of the burial ground and began digging again. This time, the soil was even harder. His arms burned with exhaustion, and his breath grew ragged. But he kept digging. And then hiss! Another snake. More scorpions. The villagers screamed in terror. Some covered their faces, others fell to their knees in prayer. The earth itself seemed to reject Zainab. It was as if something unseen was stopping her from being buried. Maulam Musa turned to the crowd. "We must find out why this is happening," he said. "There is a hidden truth here. Someone in this village knows the answer." The crowd murmured. The children who had learned from Zainab stood silently, their faces pale with fear. The women whispered among themselves, unsure of what to say. Then someone spoke. Her childhood friend, Halima. She knew Zainab better than anyone. Maybe she knows something. All eyes turned toward Halima, who stood frozen in place. Her hands trembled, and her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Maulam Musa stepped closer to her. "Halima," he said gently, "if you know anything, now is the time to tell us." Tears welled up in Halima's eyes. She shook her head slowly, as if she didn't want to remember. But deep inside she knew. She knew the reason why Zainab's grave was rejecting her. And soon, the whole village would know too. Halima stood frozen, her heart pounding like a talking drum. The entire village was staring at her, waiting. She had carried the truth in her heart for so long, afraid to speak it. But now, with the grave refusing to accept Zainab, she knew there was no escaping it. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "Zainab was not the person you all thought she was." Gasps filled the air. The villagers stepped closer, listening intently. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting for the truth. "She was my best friend," Halima continued, her voice trembling. "We memorized the Quran together. We prayed together. She taught the children and recited beautifully. But at home, she swallowed hard. At home, she was different." Maulam Musa's face remained calm, but his eyes darkened with understanding. "Tell us, Halima, what did Zainab do?" Halima closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the painful past. Zainab's mother was old and sick. She could not walk properly. She would call for help, but Zainab ignored her. Sometimes, her mother would cry for food or water, but Zainab would leave her hungry for hours. Halima wiped her tears. One day, I went to visit her, and I saw her mother lying in bed, weak and crying. She begged Zainab for water, but Zainab, she just stood there. A shocked silence spread through the crowd. Some covered their mouths in disbelief. Others shook their heads, unable to believe what they were hearing. "I couldn't take it anymore," Halima continued, her voice breaking. "I ran to get a cup of water and gave it to her mother. She drank it so quickly, as if she hadn't had water in days. She held my hand, crying, and said, 'May Allah bless you, my child.'" Halima paused, looking at the ground. Then, Zainab got angry. She slapped her own mother. A loud gasp ran through the crowd. She shouted at her, saying, "You have ruined my life. I have given up everything for you, and yet you still complain." I was so shocked, so angry. I slapped Zainab and ran out of the house. Halima's body shook with sobs. After that day, I never went back. The villagers stood still. Some had tears in their eyes. Others looked away, unable to meet each other's gaze. Malam Musa sighed deeply. His voice was soft but firm. "Allah commands us to respect our parents. He warns us not to even say oof to them in anger." And yet, Zainab did worse. She mistreated her mother, ignored her pain, and raised her hand against her. This is why the earth refuses her. A deep sadness settled over the crowd. Women clutched their children. Men lowered their heads in shame. Halima spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "Her mother died a few days after I left the village. And now, 2 weeks later, Zainab is gone too." The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Baba Suleiman, the gravedigger, stepped forward. His hands trembled as he gripped his shovel. "What do we do now, Malam Musa? The grave is still filled with snakes and scorpions. The earth refuses her." Malam Musa closed his eyes and lifted his hands in prayer. "O Allah, forgive this girl. She spent her life memorizing your words, but forgot the greatest lesson, kindness to parents." When he opened his eyes, he looked at the villagers. "We have no choice. We must bury her as she is." The people murmured, uneasy, but they knew it was the only way. With careful steps, Baba Suleiman and a few strong men carried Zainab's body back to the grave. The snakes were still there, slithering angrily, and the scorpions twitched their sharp tails. Tears streamed down the villagers' faces as they watched. Some prayed silently. Others wept openly. The children, who once loved Zainab, clutched each other in fear. With one final prayer, Baba Suleiman placed the body inside. The villagers held their breath as the earth swallowed her, along with the snakes and scorpions. When it was done, silence fell over the cemetery. The air felt heavy. The villagers slowly turned to leave, each lost in thought. As Halima walked away, she whispered, "Oh, Zainab, if only you had loved your mother the way you loved the Quran." That night, the village was different. The children held their mothers a little tighter. The men spoke more kindly to their elders. And in every home, prayers were whispered for forgiveness. For they had witnessed a lesson they would never forget.